Okay, everyone, let's get started. So, at the end of today, you will have learned half of the material from this course. We won't be halfway through in terms of time, so next week, Monday is Thanksgiving, so no class that day. Wednesday is test review day, and then next Friday is test number 2. So last class we talked about Haidt's social intuitionist model. Today we'll finish up the chapter that was associated with, and then we have 3 short-ish articles left, and we'll, I think, pretty easily be able to cover them. One of them is a critique or commentary that is somewhat critical, or at least adds some nuance to Haidt's article. And then the other 2 are, broadly speaking, about the relationship between disgust and moral judgment. So Haidt talks about emotion in general. Those 2 will be about specifically the emotion of disgust. So starting with finishing chapter 7, one distinction that will help you work your way through the chapter. It'll also be helpful when distinguishing between the kinds of claims that psychology articles make and philosophy articles make, is the distinction between cause and justification. These terms have already come up, but I just want to explicitly talk about them. I believe they're on the key terms. So a cause, that's the purview of psychology. So to say that such and such caused a moral judgment would be, it's an empirical claim. So you're all familiar about demonstrating causation. You do that through experimentation. Justification is the reason for believing that a moral judgment is right or wrong. And in the case of Haidt's article, one thing you could say is, sure, such and such emotions cause a moral judgment, but that's independent of whether there's a good justification for it. So in the case of the incest aversion, sure, it might be the case that it's caused by a particular visceral reaction that evolution has drummed into us, not by reasons that you thought about rationally, but it still could be the case that the judgment is justified. That upon reflection you may think, no, there are good reasons for this judgment. One kind of justification, and I don't think this is in the key terms, but it'll be helpful in the next section. Is rule utilitarianism. So one thing the book says is, you might say that the Julian Mark action was wrong, not because it led to bad consequences, but because it's the kind of action that, if everyone did it, it would result in bad consequences. So rule utilitarianism is usually contrasted with act utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism is the simpler one. Act utilitarianism uses happiness and suffering as the standards for making a decision. So for any particular action that you want to do, you should ask yourself, will this action lead to more happiness or more suffering? So here, utilitarianism is a decision-making criteria. Rule utilitarianism says, no, we should not bring utilitarianism to bear for specific actions, but for which kinds of rules we follow. So when deciding whether to follow this rule or this rule, we ask, which would lead to worse consequences? Rule A or Rule B? So one example I've used a few times to illustrate is torture. So it's easy to think of cases where the action of torturing someone would lead to more happiness. The classic, ticking time bomb example. There's a ticking time bomb. Someone knows where the bomb is. He won't divulge the information. If you torture him or her, you'll get the information and save lives. So if you think in that case you should torture, you're probably an act utilitarian. What someone else could say, though, is the rule, don't torture, overall will probably lead to more happiness. Even if there are particular exceptions, it's a good idea to just follow the rule. So we only bring utilitarianism to bear when deciding which rules to follow, not will this particular action increase happiness or suffering. And one thing you could say is, it's a better idea to go with rule utilitarianism because in any particular case, it's actually hard to know what the consequences will be. So you're on safer ground just going with the rules that, in general, will increase happiness. Okay, does that distinction make sense? Okay, that's all I have to say about the chapter. Let's have a look at the articles. Oh, yeah.
So you said for like the Julie and Mark case,
Yeah.
it would be bad if everyone did it? Does that fall under?
That would be an example of rule utilitarianism. So even if in this particular case, the incest doesn't lead to birth defects, incest is the kind of action that if more people did it, there would be bad consequences. Now, you don't have to worry about this, but one issue that comes up is, well, how broad do you make the rule? Because one thing you could say is, well, the rule, don't do incest unless it's this specific case where you use birth control. That rule is fine to follow as far as the consequences go. And there are debates about how, broad to make the rules that rule utilitarians propose, but you don't have to worry about that for the test. In fact, you don't have to worry about the term at all. Okay. So the first article is by David Pizarro and Paul Bloom. So these are two very important moral psychologists. We've already seen Paul Bloom. We'll see Pizarro more in the next section. He has a great podcast, by the way. There's a number of episodes on moral psych. Might be fun to look at, especially the older episodes. It's called Very Bad Wizards. He runs it with a moral philosopher. So here's the basic idea behind their critique slash request for a modification of Haidt's argument. So Haidt's argument is that reasoning basically doesn't matter. It's at least as far as individual moral judgment. We don't arrive at our moral judgments through reason. We arrive at them through intuition or emotion. What Pizarro and Bloom say is, often the intuitions and emotions we have are the result of prior reasoning. It's commonly held that in psychology that the way learning works is it starts off as a system 2 or conscious, effortful reasoning type process. And then over time, it becomes a matter of habit or intuition or system 1. As an example, think about learning a new sport or how to play a musical instrument. In the early stages, it's very effortful. You have to consciously think through what the next steps are. Once you get good at it, it becomes just a matter of habit. You don't have to consciously work through the steps. So for example, I practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I remember having the experience, so it's basically wrestling but with like chokes and arm locks. I was rolling with someone, and I noticed that I was daydreaming. I was just kind of going through the motions because it was a matter of habit. So that's an example of something moving from, where it was definitely not like that at the beginning, when you have to consciously remember and think through what the next steps are. And what Pizarro and Bloom say is something similar is true of moral judgment. There are different ways that we can exert influence on our moral judgments, but over time they can become a matter of intuition. One way we can do this is through control over the input. Input here being broadly defined. You know, what kinds of friends you have, what kinds of books you read, what kinds of situations you expose yourself to. You may consciously decide which of those to expose yourself to, and then those in turn influence what your emotions and intuitions are. Another one is cognitive appraisal. So this relates somewhat to the two-factor model that we saw in the case of emotion, right? How we interpret things or appraise things, to use the psychology term, has an influence on how we experience the emotion. So that's another path through which reasoning or conscious thought can influence emotions. The paper cites Aristotle as someone who's a kind of precursor to this view. Right? Aristotle thought that through time, morality becomes a matter of habit. Even if at first you have to deliberately practice, with time it moves into what we would now call system one, or intuition. Okay. Any questions on the yeah?
Sorry, what is the term right before cognitive appraisal?
Control over the input. Yeah. So that means you can choose so intuitions and emotions are at least partly influenced by the environment in which you're in, your friends, the movies you watch, the situations you encounter, and you have some control over which types of things you're exposed to, which is one way that you can shape your intuitions or emotions. Yeah.
And they say that we choose those based on rationality, the input?
That's or at least we can. Yeah, but that's one way through which reason can have an influence. Okay, so I see no other hands, so we're done with height then, so we'll move on to the topic of moral disgust. So the first reading, oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, could you just repeat your definition for cognitive appraisal, please?
So cognitive appraisal is how we interpret something, and it is usually used in the context of interpretations that influence emotion. So think of the two-factor theory, for example. That's an example of cognitive appraisal at work, where the interpretation or appraisal and the physiological activity together produce the emotion. Now, before we look at the first disgust reading, we have to talk about one of the, I think, coolest findings in moral psychology, and that's the Knobe effect. This is a rare case where a subtle manipulation has a very large effect. Often in psychology, including in moral psychology, we're dealing with small effect sizes that you have to get a big sample to detect. In this case, it's a huge effect, but one that's very surprising and I think very informative. We'll see it. So this is discovered by someone named Joshua Knobe. We'll show a video of it in a second. So we'll demonstrate it right here, at least one half of it. So here's a scenario I want you to imagine. There's a CEO who is thinking about selling a new product. Some new product, but someone on his staff comes into his office and says, "Sir, if we release this new product, it will hurt the environment." And the CEO says, "I don't care about that. I just want to make lots of money." So they release the product and it hurts the environment. Here's the question. Did he hurt the environment on purpose? Show of hands, who thinks yes? Interesting. You are an exception to the rule. So this may have less of a punch than I had hoped, but so maybe 40-ish% of the class says yes. It was supposed to be 80, but hey, you're all free thinkers. So here's the finding. So if you give this to large samples of people, you generally find that around 80% of people, in this case, say yes. If you change just 3 letters, so exact same scenario, CEO is making a product. Oh, sir, if we do that, it will help the environment. I don't care about that. I just care about making lots of money. And he releases the product. So word for word the same, but the only difference is the outcome is a good one. And now only 20%, so exactly the opposite, say that it's on purpose, that he helped the environment on purpose. So we may have thought that on purpose was a purely descriptive concept, but in fact, the positivity or lack thereof of the outcome influences whether or not you think something is on purpose. So, just to make this precise, or image rates below. So, if there is an outcome, in this case, help versus hurt the environment, that is foreseen, so they know it's going to happen, but not the main goal, right? It's not what they care about, so they know it's going to happen, but it's not what they're mainly aiming at. If the outcome is bad, the foreseen but not main goal outcome is bad, people tend to say, except for this class, that it's intentional. If it's good, they tend to say it's not intentional or on purpose. So that is the Knobe effect. Large effect size, well replicated. Any questions about the Knobe effect? Okay, just to hammer it home, I'll show a quick video of Knobe explaining it in his own words. Okay. So what's going on here? One thing, so different explanations you could give. One is that when we say you do something intentionally, part of what we mean is you deserve praise or blame for it. Right? It's not just a descriptive concept. It has to do with whether or not we're going to hold you morally responsible. And if it's a foreseen but not the main goal bad outcome, we do want to hold you responsible. Right? So in the case of the CEO, if we found out about this, we probably want to say that guy should be penalized in some way for his action. But if it's the foreseen but not main goal thing, but it's a good outcome, we wouldn't want to hold you responsible. Meaning, we wouldn't want to say, kudos to you for helping the environment. We want to say, like, we're not impressed. So that could be partly what's going on. I'll note, you may have seen the title of the video. Joshua Knobe is an example of a researcher in the field that's come to be known as experimental philosophy. My supervisor, Eddie Nomius, was another person in this area. We'll see a reading from him toward the end of the semester. So experimental philosophy involves giving ordinary people different philosophical thought experiments and seeing how they respond. One motivation for this is the view in philosophy that the meaning of terms is fixed by how they are ordinarily used. I think I mentioned in passing this was Wittgenstein's view. So philosophers often assert, oh, this is what ordinary people think, but then some people thought, well, let's go find out. Now, don't tell my supervisor that I said this, but this is basically psychology. But if you see it in the literature, that's what it's referring to. It's psychology of how ordinary people think about philosophy. But if my supervisor asks, I never said that.
Said what?
That experimental philosophy is basically psychology.
Yeah,
just
I know.
psychology.
It was a
of.
joke, yeah.
I see. Okay, so what does this have to do with moral disgust? Well, there are some moral judgments that people may be less likely to, A, they may not be fully aware that they have a certain moral tendency, and B, they may not want to admit that they have it. So one thing you can do with the Knobe effect is use it as a measure of unconscious moral tendencies. As a measure of moral evaluations that people are unlikely to consciously articulate. I guess I shouldn't have erased all of that, but so remember the structure. So you have a foreseen outcome that is not the main goal. And if it's bad, a bad outcome, you judge that it was done intentionally, or at least you're more likely to. Whereas if it's a good outcome, you are more likely to say it's not intentional. So what some psychologists have done is used it in reverse, use it as a indirect measure of whether or not they think it's a bad outcome. So this brings us to the study done by UL Imbar and some co-authors. I guess you'll know all of them. So one of them is Josh Knobe, and then it's Pizarro and Bloom, the people we just looked at in the previous article. Imbar is at University of Toronto, if any of you want to go there for grad school or something else. So they describe a similar situation. So there's a CEO, I think they make it a CEO of a music company, and they're going to release a new album. And someone comes into the CEO's room and says, if we release this album, more straight couples will engage in French kissing in public. And the guy says, I don't care about that, I just want to make lots of money, and they do it. That's one scenario. In the other one, it's if we release this album, more gay men will kiss in public. And the guy says, I don't care about that, I just care about making lots of money. And then you ask, and then more straight people kiss or more gay men kiss. And you say, did he cause more people to kiss intentionally or not intentionally? And the idea is, if they say intentionally, that at least is an indirect measure of the extent to which they think it's a bad outcome. They may not come out and say that, but this is an indirect indication of that. Does the basic logic of the experiment make sense? You can ask your friends this, like, hey, if the CEO, did this thing that made more gay men kiss, was it on purpose? Oh yeah, totally on purpose. And gotcha. So first of all, one simple descriptive statistic, people are more likely to say that the CEO caused the kissing intentionally if it's gay men kissing. So, not surprising, shows that more people have at least an implicit tendency to view gay kissing as morally wrong. But the connection to moral disgust is they included a well-validated scale that measured disgust sensitivity. So how easily grossed out are you? And they found that people who are higher in disgust sensitivity are more likely to say that the CEO caused the gay kissing intentionally. But they are no more likely to say that the straight kissing was caused intentionally. Don't worry as much about this. We'll go into this in more detail in a later chapter, but they also use the implicit association test. How many of you know about the implicit association test? Maybe half. So if you take social psych, there's a lot of work on this. This is the one where you have a computer in front of you, and you have to press the right key or the left key. And the most famous one is the race IAT. So for the first half, you have to press the right key if it's a good word or a black face. So for good words and black faces, you have to press the right key. For bad words and white faces, left key. They randomize the order, obviously, but for some people it'll be like that. In the next condition, it's the opposite. You press the right key for a good word or a white face, and left key for bad word or black face. So they have like a set of like, faces that look African American, a set of words like, positive, happy, lucky, etc. And what you find is, on average, people are slightly slower at doing this when it's the good word blackface. And you can measure the difference in reaction time and use that as a measure of implicit bias against, in that case, African Americans. But you can do the same thing with words related to sexual orientation. So for the first half of the experiment, good word or word related to straight people, and then you switch it for the second condition. So this is another way of measuring implicit disapproval of homosexuality. And again, you find that it is correlated with disgust sensitivity. So people who are higher in disgust sensitivity find it a little harder to press the keys when it's a good word and a homosexual word. Okay, so one of the co-authors, this is the one who also has his own podcast, David Pizarro, will talk a bit more about the relationship between disgust and moral judgment, as well as the data in this experiment. Okay, so that's all I have to say about the Knobe effect paper. Any questions about that? Yep.
Do they think that you can change your disgust sensitivity, or you're just kind of stuck with it?
That's a good question. I mean, in psychology, almost nothing is, unchangeable. So I don't know of research into attempts to increase, or I guess improve is value laden. Maybe being too low is bad or too high is bad. But I don't know of studies trying to change people's disgust sensitivity, but I'd be pretty surprised if it was totally unchangeable. One thing that is worth noting too is, remember that, so in the video, for those of you who are watching later, he outlined several lines of evidence finding that political conservatism in general is correlated with higher disgust sensitivity, or, as he says, wording it the other way, liberals are lower on average, harder to gross out. Where was I going with this? Oh yeah, that's right. So one connection to a prior reading is that conservatives care more about the purity dimension. Remember that Haidt says that is thought to be rooted in the disgust system. So that's a connection to something we've already seen. Yep.
Does disgust sensitivity have anything to do with threat sensitivity, since they're both correlated to conservatism?
I mean, conceptually you could draw a connection, right? Disgust is a response to a particular kind of threat, namely the threat of contamination. So there's kind of conceptual link there. I don't know of empirical studies finding if there's a correlation, although I suspect there would be, because both would be associated, say, with neuroticism, right? Kind of sensitivity to negative emotion. So, but I'm going a bit off the cuff there. I'd have to double check that. But it's a good question. Maybe you could write your paper on it. Okay, the last reading will not take very much time. So in that same vein, so he mentioned there are studies that use physiological measures like heart rate in response to disgusting images, and use that to predict political orientation. But one really cool paper used machine learning, so a kind of AI system, and trained it on data from brain scans. So they scanned people's brains as they looked at different kinds of affective type pictures. So they had 4 types: disgusting pictures, threatening pictures, pleasant ones, and neutral ones. They also looked at self-reported responses to these different pictures. So how disgusting is this picture, for example? And then the neural responses. And using machine learning, they found that neural responses to the disgusting pictures were the best predictors of political orientation. So, self-reported disgust only marginally correlated with it. It was just shy of being statistically significant, but you could explain a large amount of the variance in political conservatism using people's neural responses to specifically the disgusting pictures. So someone just asked about threat versus disgust. They had threatening ones too, and in this case, disgusting pictures were a better predictor. Yep.
Who was that finding from? Sorry.
The name of the researcher is On, and I actually don't know how to say it. It's not someone I know anything about other than they wrote this. Okay. And that is all the information you need for test number 2. So we still have 10-ish minutes left. It's still a week before the test, so I won't give the written yet. I won't be that nice. But I will give one Thanksgiving gift to you all. A lot of the key terms have the word reason in it. You know, theoretical reason, practical reason. Don't worry about those. Happy Thanksgiving. So the key terms that have the word reason in it, you know, theoretical reason, practical reason, reason as an ability, don't worry about those. Yep.
Are there any of the readings that we should just ignore, like the last exam?
No, not at least none that come to mind. Although, as before, in general, they'll be the ones I spent more time on. Like last time, I'll throw in maybe a couple of ones that are a bit more obscure, but focus more of your time on the terms I spent more time on. Okay, any other questions? Okay, I see no hands. I will see you all next Wednesday for test review.